I was getting ready for bed on a Thursday night when I heard something slide under my apartment door, that soft scraping sound of paper against hardwood. And at first I thought it was just a flyer or a notice from building management about maintenance or a package delivery. But when I walked over and picked it up, my hands started shaking because it wasn't a flyer. It was a folded piece of plain white paper. And when I opened it, there were just 3 words written in black ink: "You're next." And the handwriting, the careful, deliberate loops, and the way the letters slanted slightly to the right, looked disturbingly familiar, looked exactly like my sister's Monique's handwriting, the sister who'd been found dead in her apartment 6 weeks earlier, the sister whose death had been ruled a suicide, even though I knew deep in my bones that Monique would never take her own life. And now someone was using her handwriting to threaten me? And I realized that everything I'd suspected about my sister's death might be true, and that I might be in serious danger. I'm so glad you're here. If you're watching this video, please like and subscribe to my channel and tell me in the comments where you're listening to my story from. I want to know how far it's traveled, because what started with a threatening note under my door turned into an investigation that revealed a conspiracy so deep and so dangerous that it threatened not just my life, but the lives of everyone in my family. And I need you to hear every detail of how a 54-year-old Black woman who worked as a librarian became an amateur detective trying to solve her sister's murder while staying one step ahead of whoever was coming for her next. My name is Lorraine. I'm 54 years old, and I've lived in Chicago my entire life, working at the Harold Washington Library for the past 23 years in the reference department, helping people find information, answering questions, organizing archives. It's quiet, predictable work. Exactly what I wanted after growing up in a chaotic household with 4 siblings and parents who fought constantly. My childhood was marked by instability. My father worked long hours at the steel mill when there was work and drank heavily when there wasn't. And my mother tried to hold everything together, tried to keep food on the table and the lights on and us kids out of trouble. But it was hard. We moved a lot, always one step ahead of eviction, always struggling. And I promised myself that when I grew up, my life would be different, would be stable, would be calm and controlled. And for the most part, I'd achieved that. I had my apartment in Hyde Park, a cozy 1-bedroom that I'd lived in for 12 years. I had my cat, Zora, named after Zora Neale Hurston. I had my book club that met every month. I had my routines, my morning coffee at the same cafe, my evening walks along the lake, my Saturday visits to the farmer's market. And I was content. Or at least I thought I was, until 6 weeks ago when I got the call that changed everything. It was my younger brother, Antoine, calling at 2 in the morning, which is never good news. My phone was on my nightstand, and when it rang, I knew immediately something was wrong, because Antoine never called that late, never disturbed my sleep unless it was an emergency. And when I answered, my voice thick with sleep, he was crying, actually sobbing, saying, "Lorraine, you need to come to Monique's apartment right now. Something happened, something bad, and the police are here, and I don't know what to do." And I sat up in bed, my heart already pounding, and I said, "What happened, Antoine? Is Monique okay?" And there was this terrible pause, this silence that seemed to stretch on forever. And then he said, "She's gone, Lorraine. Monique's gone. They found her in her bedroom. She took pills. They're saying she killed herself, but that can't be right. That can't be true. Monique wouldn't do that." I threw on clothes, barely registering what I was putting on: jeans, a sweatshirt, shoes without socks. And I drove across the city to Monique's place in Bronzeville, running red lights, not caring about speed limits, just needing to get there, needing to see for myself, needing to understand what had happened. And when I got there, the street was full of police cars and an ambulance with lights flashing red and blue against the dark houses. And there were neighbors standing on their porches in bathrobes and pajamas, watching and whispering. And Antoine was standing on the sidewalk in front of Monique's building, looking shattered, looking like someone had physically broken him. And when he saw me, he grabbed me and held on tight and said, "They won't let me go inside. They're treating it like a crime scene, but they're saying it's suicide. And I don't understand, Lorraine. I just talked to her yesterday and she was fine. She was excited about some story she was working on. She wasn't depressed. She wasn't suicidal. This doesn't make sense." I tried to push past the police officers, tried to get into the building, tried to see Monique, but they stopped me, said this was an active investigation, said I couldn't go in until they'd finished processing the scene. And I stood there on that sidewalk with Antoine, both of us crying, both of us in shock, trying to understand how this could have happened. And finally, after what felt like hours, a detective came out, a tired-looking white man in his 50s who introduced himself as Detective Morrison and said he was sorry for our loss, said they'd found Monique in her bedroom, said it appeared she'd taken an overdose of sleeping pills, said there was a note. And I said, "What kind of note? What did it say?" And he pulled out his phone and showed me a photo of handwritten note that said, "I'm sorry, I can't do this anymore. I'm tired of fighting, tired of everything. Please forgive me." And it was signed with Monique's name. I stared at that note, and something about it felt wrong. I couldn't put my finger on it exactly, but the words didn't sound like Monique, didn't sound like my fierce, determined sister who never gave up on anything, who fought for everything she believed in, who spent her entire career as an investigative journalist, taking on powerful people and exposing corruption and holding truth to power. And I said to Detective Morrison, "This doesn't make sense. My sister wouldn't kill herself. She was working on a big story. She was excited about it. We just had lunch 2 days ago and she was fine." And he gave me this look, this sympathetic but dismissive look that I would come to know very well over the next few weeks. And he said, "Ma'am, I understand this is difficult. Families always have a hard time accepting suicide, but there's no evidence of foul play, no signs of struggle, no indication that anyone else was in the apartment. The door was locked from the inside, the windows were closed, your sister was alone when she died, and she left a note explaining why. Sometimes people hide their pain, even from those closest to them." But I knew Monique better than anyone. We weren't just sisters, we were best friends. We talked on the phone almost every day, sometimes multiple times a day. We texted constantly, we met for lunch at least twice a week. We shared everything, our hopes, our fears, our frustrations, our joys. And if Monique had been struggling, if she'd been depressed, if she'd been contemplating suicide, she would have told me. She would have reached out. She would have asked for help. That's just who she was. She wasn't someone who suffered in silence. She was someone who reached out, who asked for support, who believed in the power of community and connection. And the idea that she'd kill herself without saying anything to anyone, without leaving any warning signs beyond a note that didn't even sound like her, was impossible to accept. Monique and I grew up close, closer than I was with my other siblings. There were 5 of us total, me being the oldest, then my brother Marcus, then Monique, then Antoine, and finally our youngest sister Renee. And Monique was always the fighter, always the one standing up to bullies, always the one questioning authority, always the one demanding answers. When she was 12, she organized a protest at our school because the cafeteria was serving spoiled food. When she was 16, she wrote an exposé for the school newspaper about how the football team was getting preferential treatment and academic resources that other students didn't have access to. When she was in college at Northwestern studying journalism, she covered campus sexual assault cases and held administrators accountable for their failures to protect students. And when she graduated and got hired by the Chicago Tribune, she continued that work on a larger scale, investigating corruption, fraud, abuse of power. Her work had resulted in indictments of public officials, had exposed corporate malfeasance, had brought justice to people who'd been harmed by those in power. She'd won awards for her reporting. She was respected, feared by those she investigated, and loved by those she'd helped. And she loved her work, loved the thrill of uncovering truth, loved the challenge of following leads and connecting dots, loved the satisfaction of seeing her stories make a real difference in the world. Just 2 days before she died, we'd had lunch together at Addis Ababa, our favorite Ethiopian restaurant on the north side. We'd been going there for years, knew the owner, knew the menu by heart, always ordered the same things, the kifo, the dorawat, the vegetarian combination. And we'd sat in our usual booth in the back, and Monique had been animated, excited, talking rapidly, the way she always did when she was working on something big, something important. She told me she was close to breaking a major story, something that would expose corruption at the highest levels of Chicago government, something that involved millions of dollars and powerful people who'd been operating with impunity for years. And I'd asked her what specifically the story was about, Who was involved? What kind of corruption? And she'd gotten this look in her eyes, this mix of excitement and caution, and she'd leaned forward and lowered her voice, even though there was no one sitting near us. And she'd said, "Lorraine, I can't give you all the details yet, not until I have everything locked down, but it involves a massive development project on the lakefront. It involves city officials taking bribes. It involves environmental violations. It involves the displacement of thousands of low-income residents, primarily Black and brown families, who are being forced out of their homes to make way for luxury condos and hotels and retail spaces that they'll never be able to afford. And the people behind it have been very careful. They've hidden their tracks well, but I've found the connections. I've traced the money, I've got documents and sources, and I'm close, so close, to having everything I need to publish." I'd felt proud of her listening to her talk, proud of her dedication, proud of her courage. But I had also felt worried because I knew that investigating powerful people could be dangerous, that people who had a lot to lose would do almost anything to protect themselves. And I'd said, "Monique, are you being careful? Are you watching your back? Are you making sure you're safe?" And she'd waved off my concerns, said she'd been doing this work for 15 years, said she knew how to protect herself, said she had backup plans and secure communication methods, and that I shouldn't worry. And I'd wanted to believe her, wanted to trust that she knew what she was doing. But now sitting on that sidewalk at 2 in the morning with police lights flashing and my brother crying and Detective Morrison telling me my sister had killed herself, I realized I should have pushed harder, should have insisted she be more careful, should have done something, anything, to protect her. The funeral was 4 days later, and it was one of the hardest days of my life. Standing in that church, looking at Monique's casket covered in flowers, listening to people talk about what a wonderful person she was, what a talented journalist she was, how much she'd be missed. And the whole time, I was angry. Angry that she was gone, angry that the police had closed the case so quickly, angry that everyone seemed to accept the suicide narrative without question, angry that no one except me and Antoine seemed to think there was anything suspicious about her death. Marcus, our middle brother, who lived in Los Angeles and worked in tech, had flown in for the funeral and he seemed to accept the official story. Seemed to think that Monique must have been struggling with depression, that she'd hidden it well, but that suicide made sense given the pressures of her job. Renee, our youngest sister who lived in Indianapolis with her husband and 3 kids, was devastated but also seemed to believe the police, seemed to think that we'd all missed signs of Monique's deteriorating mental health. But Antoine and I, we knew better. We'd both been close to Monique, had both talked to her regularly, had both seen how excited she was about her work, how engaged she was with life. And after the funeral, after everyone had gone back to their hotels or homes, Antoine and I sat in my apartment and we talked about what we should do, whether we should push the police to investigate further, whether we should hire a private investigator, whether we should just accept what we'd been told and try to move on. And I said, "I can't just accept it, Antoine. I can't let this go. I know in my gut that Monique didn't kill herself. I know someone did this to her, and I'm going to find out who." And Antoine said, "I'll help you, Lorraine. Whatever you need, I'm here." The next day, Antoine and I went to Monique's apartment. The landlord had given us keys and told us we had 30 days to clear out her things. And when we walked in, I felt this overwhelming wave of grief. Seeing her furniture, her books, her photos on the walls, the coffee mug still sitting on her kitchen counter, the jacket hanging by the door, all these everyday objects that proved she'd been alive, that she'd lived in this space, that she'd had routines and habits and plans for the future, and now she was gone, and all that was left were things. We started going through her belongings systematically. I took her bedroom and Anton took her home office, and we were looking for anything related to the story she'd been working on. Any notes, any documents, any evidence that would tell us what she'd uncovered, who she'd been investigating, who might have wanted her dead. The police had taken her laptop and her phone as part of their investigation, and supposedly they'd found nothing suspicious on either device. No threats, no unusual communications, no indication that she'd been in danger. But I knew Monique, and I knew she was careful about her work, especially when she was investigating dangerous people. She wouldn't keep sensitive information on devices that could be hacked or seized. She'd have backups. She'd have physical copies. She'd have hidden storage. And I was determined to find it. In her bedroom closet, buried under a pile of old sweaters, I found a lockbox. It was small, metal, fireproof, the kind you'd keep important documents in, and it had a combination lock. And I tried a few obvious combinations: her birthday, my birthday, our mother's birthday, but none of them worked. And then I tried something else. I tried the date that our father died, the date that had marked a turning point in all our lives, April 15th, 2003. And the box clicked open. And inside were papers, lots of papers, documents that look like financial records, bank statements, wire transfer receipts, property records, and business filings. And there were also handwritten notes, pages and pages of Monique's distinctive handwriting, with arrows and circles and question marks, connecting different pieces of information, creating a web of connections that told a story of corruption and fraud. I sat there on Monique's bedroom floor with that lockbox, and I started reading through everything, trying to understand what she'd uncovered. And the picture that emerged was shocking and complex. It centered on something called the Lakefront Development Project, a massive undertaking that had been announced about a year ago with great fanfare. The plan was to redevelop 5 miles of Chicago's South Side lakefront, transforming what was currently a mix of parks and low-income housing and small businesses into a gleaming showcase of luxury condos, high-end retail, upscale restaurants, and boutique hotels. The project was being led by a development company called Shoreline Properties, and it had the full support of the mayor's office, the city council, and various business organizations. They'd held community meetings where they'd promised that the development would bring jobs and economic growth and opportunities for local residents. But according to Monique's notes, none of that was true. What Monique had discovered was that the Lakefront Development Project was built on a foundation of lies, corruption, and fraud. The environmental impact studies that had been used to justify the project had been falsified. The studies had downplayed the risks to the lake ecosystem, had ignored concerns about pollution, and had misrepresented the impact on local wildlife. And the company that had conducted those studies had been paid 3 times the normal rate and had significant financial ties to Shoreline Properties. The property acquisitions that were displacing thousands of low-income residents were being done through intimidation and coercion. Residents were being offered far less than their properties were worth, were being given very short deadlines to accept or reject offers, were being told that if they didn't sell voluntarily, the city would use eminent domain to take their properties. And many residents were elderly or non-English speakers who didn't fully understand their rights and were being taken advantage of. But the corruption went deeper than that. Monique had traced the ownership of Shoreline Properties and had discovered it was a shell company, owned by another shell company, owned by another shell company. And when you followed the chain far enough, you found that the ultimate owners were a group of investors that included the mayor's brother, a city council member, a judge who'd been ruling in favor of the development project, and several prominent businessmen who had extensive ties to organized crime. The financing for the project was coming from offshore accounts and appeared to involve money laundering. The contracts for the project were being awarded without proper competitive bidding to companies that overcharged and did shoddy work and then kicked back portions of their profits to city officials who'd approve the contracts. The whole thing was rotten, from top to bottom, a conspiracy that involved dozens of people all working together to enrich themselves at the expense of the community. I sat there on Monique's floor, reading through her notes, feeling this mix of awe and horror. Awe at the incredible investigative work she'd done, at how she'd connected all these pieces, at how thorough and meticulous she'd been.
and horror at the scale of the corruption, at the sheer audacity of these people, at the fact that they were willing to displace thousands of families, to destroy a community, to violate environmental laws, all for profit. And I understood why Monique had been killed. I understood that she'd uncovered something so damaging, so explosive, that the people involved couldn't afford to let her publish it. I called Antoine into the bedroom and showed him what I'd found, and he read through some of the documents and said, "Lorraine, this is huge. This is potentially criminal charges for dozens of people, including the mayor's brother. This is front page news. This is career ending. This is exactly the kind of thing that would make people desperate." And I said, "Exactly, Anton, this is why Monique was killed. She was about to expose all of this, and someone stopped her. And we need to figure out who, specifically, who knew what she was working on, who had access to her apartment, who could have forced her to take those pills." We spent the rest of that day and most of the next going through every single paper in Monique's apartment, looking for more evidence, looking for names, looking for any indication of who might have known about her investigation. And I found a calendar where Monique had kept track of her meetings and appointments. And in the week before she died, she'd met with several people. There was a meeting with someone marked DC at a coffee shop. There was a meeting with someone marked MR at their office. There was a meeting with someone marked AL at an undisclosed location. And there were also several notes that said, "Follow up on PD," which I assumed meant police department, and "check BR connections," which I thought might refer to the mayor's brother, whose initials were BR for Benjamin Richardson. I took photos of everything with my phone, photographed every document, every note, every page of Monique's calendar. And then I packed up all the physical evidence and took it home with me, because I had this feeling that whoever had killed Monique would come back to her apartment looking for exactly what I'd found, would want to destroy any evidence of her investigation. And I wasn't going to let that happen. I wasn't going to let them erase my sister's work. Back at my apartment, I started trying to figure out who the initials in Monique's calendar referred to. Who were the people she'd met with in the days before she died? DC was probably David Chen, a journalist colleague of Monique's who I knew she'd worked with on previous investigations. I'd met him a few times at various events, and I remembered him because he was one of the few people at the Tribune who seemed to really respect Monique, who saw her as an equal rather than a competitor. MR could have been dozens of people, but given the context of the investigation, I wondered if it might be Michael Rodriguez, a city council member who'd been one of the few voices opposing the lakefront development project, who'd raised concerns about the environmental impact and the displacement of residents. And AL? I had no idea who that could be. I decided to start with David Chen because he was the easiest to contact. I found his number through the Tribune's website and called him. And when he answered, and I identified myself as Monique's sister, his voice changed, became subdued, and he said, "Lorraine, I'm so sorry about Monique. I still can't believe she's gone. She was one of the best journalists I've ever known." And I said, "David, I need to talk to you about Monique's death because I don't think it was suicide. I think it was murdered because of the story she was working on. And I need to know if she told you anything about it, if you know who she was investigating, if you have any information that might help me figure out what happened." There was a long pause, and then David said, "Meet me tomorrow. Let's talk in person, not on the phone." And that response more than anything confirmed my suspicions. Because if David was worried about talking on the phone, that meant he thought the investigation. I left that meeting with David feeling both more informed and more frightened, because now I knew that Monique had been close, so close to breaking the story, had been within days, maybe hours, of having everything she needed, and someone had stopped her. And that someone was still out there, was still protecting their secrets, was still dangerous. and I needed to be very careful. I spent the next week digging deeper into the lakefront development project, reading everything I could find online, studying the documents Monique had collected, trying to understand who all the players were. And I realized that the conspiracy was even bigger than I had initially thought. It wasn't just about one development project. It was about a systematic effort to gentrify large parts of Chicago's South Side, to displace low-income communities, primarily communities of color, and replace them with wealthy white residents who would pay higher property taxes, who would shop at upscale stores, who would transform neighborhoods that had been home to Black families for generations. And the Lakefront Development Project was just the most visible part of it, just the tip of the iceberg. I also started noticing things that made me think someone was watching me. I'd see the same car parked on my street several days in a row. I'd notice the same man in a baseball cap at the coffee shop I went to every morning. I'd get strange clicks and echoes on my phone calls that suggested my phone might be tapped. And I'd come home to find small things out of place. A book moved slightly, a drawer not quite closed all the way, my computer in sleep mode when I was sure I'd shut it down completely. And I realized that whoever had killed Monique knew I was investigating, knew I had her evidence, knew I was a threat, and they were monitoring me, trying to figure out what I knew, what I was planning to do. That was when I decided I needed help, needed someone I could trust, someone with legal expertise, someone who could advise me on how to proceed safely. And I called my oldest friend, Denise, who I'd known since we were 7 years old, growing up in the same neighborhood, going to the same schools, staying close even as our lives took different paths. Denise had gone to law school, had become a defense attorney, and had spent her career fighting for people who'd been wronged by the system. And if anyone could help me navigate this situation, it was her. I met with Denise at her house, and I told her everything, showed her all the documents, explained about the threatening note that would come later, explained about David Chen and the missing source, explained about feeling like I was being watched. And Denise listened carefully, taking notes. And when I finished, she was quiet for a long moment. And then she said, "Lorraine, you're in serious danger. These are powerful people with a lot to lose, and they've already killed at least once, probably twice, if your sister's source is really missing. You can't investigate this on your own. You need to bring in law enforcement. You need to make this public." And I said, "But Denise, the corruption involves police officers. It involves judges. I don't know who I can trust." And she said, "Then we find someone we can trust. We find someone clean, someone with a reputation for integrity, and we give them everything and we make it impossible for them to ignore." Denise made some calls, reached out to contacts she had in law enforcement, and she found an FBI agent named Sarah Martinez, who specialized in corruption cases, who had a spotless reputation, who'd taken down several major crime organizations. And we set up a meeting with Agent Martinez, and I brought all of Monique's evidence, and I explained everything. And Agent Martinez listened, and then she said, "Mrs. Williams, I need you to understand something. What you're describing is a major federal case. If even half of what your sister uncovered is accurate, we're talking about RICO charges. We're talking about dozens of arrests. We're talking about years of investigation. But I also need you to understand that investigating this officially is going to take time. We'll need to verify everything independently. We'll need to build our own case. We'll need to get warrants and subpoenas and follow proper procedures. And during that time, you're going to continue to be in danger because these people are going to know we're investigating, and they're going to be desperate." Agent Martinez said she could offer me protection, could put me in a safe house or provide security, but she couldn't guarantee my safety 100%. And she said the other option is to go public, to give the story to a journalist, to get it published so that everyone knows the truth. And once it's public, once the information is out there, killing you becomes pointless because it won't make the story go away. And I said, that's what Monique would have wanted the truth to come out, wanted people to know what was happening. And Agent Martinez nodded and said, then that's what we'll do. We'll work both angles. I'll start a federal investigation, and you'll work with a journalist to get the story published. And hopefully, between the two approaches, we can get justice for your sister and stop these people from hurting anyone else. I left that meeting feeling slightly better, feeling like I had allies, feeling like maybe Monique's death wouldn't be in vain. But I also felt terrified because Agent Martinez had confirmed what I already suspected, that I was in serious danger, that the people behind this conspiracy wouldn't hesitate to kill me if they thought I was a threat, and I needed to be very, very careful. That night, I went home and I started making copies of everything. All of Monique's documents, all of her notes, all of the evidence I'd collected. I made 3 complete sets. One I gave to Denise to keep in her office safe, one I put in a safe deposit box at a bank, and one I kept with me in case I needed it. And then I started reaching out to journalists, trying to find someone who'd be willing to take on this story, someone who wouldn't be intimidated, someone who would do justice to Monique's investigation. I called David first and told him about my meeting with Agent Martinez and asked if he'd be willing to publish the story. And David said, yes, absolutely. Monique started this investigation and I want to finish it. I want to make sure her work gets out there. But David, you need to understand that once this story publishes, once we expose these people, there's going to be blowback. There are going to be threats. There might be lawsuits. There will definitely be attempts to discredit the story and discredit Monique and you and me and anyone else involved. Are you prepared for that? And I said, yes, David, I'm prepared, because the alternative is letting these people get away with murder, letting them continue to hurt people, letting Monique's death mean nothing. And I can't do that. David and I spent the next week working together. He came to my apartment and we went through all of Monique's evidence, piece by piece. And he started making calls to sources, started verifying information, started building the story. And it was painstaking work, but necessary work, because we needed the story to be bulletproof, needed it to be so well documented that no one could dismiss it or claim it was fake news. And David was thorough, was careful, was the kind of journalist Monique had been. And watching him work made me feel like my sister's spirit was still present, was still fighting for truth and justice. And then one night, when I came home from work at the library, I found that note slipped under my door. You're next, written in handwriting that looked exactly like Monique's. And everything changed. I stood there in my apartment hallway holding that note, and I felt this mix of terror and rage. Because whoever had killed Monique, whoever had stolen her handwriting, was practicing copying it, was now using it to threaten me. And the message was clear. They knew I was investigating. They knew I had evidence. They knew I was working with David Chen to publish the story. And they wanted me to stop, wanted me to be afraid, wanted me to back down, or they would kill me, just like they'd killed Monique. I took photos of the note, documented everything, and then I called Denise, and I called David, and I called Agent Martinez, and I told them all what had happened. And they all said the same thing, that this proved we were on the right track, proved that we were getting close, proved that the people behind this were feeling threatened. And Agent Martinez said, Lorraine, I'm going to assign protection to you starting tonight. I'm sending agents to watch your apartment, and I'm going to recommend you stay somewhere else, somewhere these people don't know about, at least until we can make some arrests. But I said no to the safe house, said I wasn't going to hide, wasn't going to let these people drive me out of my own home, wasn't going to live in fear. And David said, then we need to move faster. We need to get this story published as soon as possible, because once it's public, once everyone knows the truth, you'll be safer, because killing you won't serve any purpose. And I agreed. And David said, give me 3 more days, just 3 more days to verify the last few pieces, and then we publish. And those will be the most dangerous 3 days. But after that, you'll be safe. Those 3 days were the longest of my life.
On the third day, David called me and said, "It's done. The story's finished. My editors have approved it. We're publishing tomorrow morning, front page Chicago Tribune and online. And Lorraine, it's good. It's really good. It's the kind of story that's going to change things." And I felt this mix of relief and fear. Relief that Monique's work was finally going to see the light of day. Fear about what would happen next, about how the people implicated in the story would react, about whether publishing would really keep me safe or would just make me an even bigger target. That night, I couldn't sleep. I sat in Denise's guest room, refreshing the Tribune's website over and over, waiting for the story to appear. And finally, at 6 a.m., it went live. The headline read, "Lakefront Development Project Built on Corruption, Fraud." And the subheading read, "Investigative journalist Monique Williams was murdered for uncovering massive conspiracy involving city officials, developers, and organized crime." And there was Monique's photo right at the top of the article, and a note that said, "This investigation was begun by Monique Williams, whose suspicious death is now being investigated as a homicide by the FBI. Her work is continued here by David Chen with the full documentation she compiled before her death." I started reading, and David had done an incredible job. He'd laid out everything Monique had discovered: the environmental fraud, the illegal property seizures, the money laundering, the connections to organized crime, the involvement of the mayor's brother and city officials and judges. He'd included financial documents, he'd included testimony from sources, he'd included the timeline of Monique's investigation, and he'd made it clear that Monique hadn't killed herself, that she'd been murdered to silence her, and that her death was part of this larger conspiracy. Within an hour, the story was everywhere. Every news outlet in Chicago was covering it. National news was picking it up. Social media was exploding with people sharing the article, with people demanding accountability, with people expressing outrage at the corruption and the murder. And by 9 a.m., the mayor was holding a press conference saying he was shocked and appalled by the allegations, saying he had no knowledge of his brother's involvement, saying he was calling for a full investigation. And within hours, the FBI was making arrests. The first person arrested was Anthony Lee, the missing accountant who hadn't actually been missing but had been in FBI protective custody the whole time. Turns out Agent Martinez had found him, had offered him immunity in exchange for testimony, had kept him safe while building the case against everyone else. And with Anthony Lee's testimony, and with Monique's documents, and with the story now public, the case against the conspirators was solid. Over the next week, more arrests followed. The mayor's brother was arrested. The city council member was arrested. The judge was arrested. 3 police officers were arrested. The developers behind Shoreline Properties were arrested. And every day there were new headlines, new revelations, new pieces of the puzzle falling into place. And I watched it all unfold with this mix of satisfaction and grief. Satisfaction that justice was finally being served. Grief that Monique wasn't here to see it, that she'd been killed before she could witness the impact of her work, before she could see the powerful people she'd been investigating being held accountable. But the biggest break in the case came when one of the developers, a man named Thomas Brennan, decided to make a deal with prosecutors. In exchange for a reduced sentence, he agreed to testify about everything, including who had ordered Monique's murder. And according to Brennan's testimony, it had been the mayor's brother, Benjamin Richardson, who'd made the decision. Richardson had learned through his contacts in the police department that Monique was getting close to publishing her story, had learned that she had documents that proved everything, and he'd panicked, had reached out to people he knew in organized crime, people who owed him favors, and he'd arranged for Monique to be killed.
The actual murder had been carried out by a man named Vincente Caruso, who worked as an enforcer for one of Chicago's crime families. Caruso had broken into Monique's apartment late at night while she was sleeping, had forced her at gunpoint to write the suicide note, had watched while she copied it over and over until the handwriting looked natural, looked like something she would have written voluntarily, and then he'd forced her to take the sleeping pills, had held her down while she struggled, had watched her die. And then he staged the scene to look like suicide, had locked the door from the inside and climbed out the window and down the fire escape, leaving no trace that anyone else had been there. When I heard the details of how my sister had died, when I learned that she'd been terrorized in her final moments, that she'd known what was happening, that she'd tried to fight, I felt a rage so intense it consumed me. But I also felt something else. I felt gratitude that the truth was finally known, that Monique's story was being told, that the people who'd killed her were being held accountable, and that her death, even though it was tragic and unjust, hadn't been in vain. Anthony Lee was arrested and charged with first-degree murder, and when I learned who he was, I realized something. The note that had been slipped under my door, the one that said, "You're next," in Monique's handwriting, had probably been written by him. It had probably been created using the practice sheets he'd made Monique create before he killed her. And that note had been meant to terrorize me, had been meant to make me back down, had been meant to silence me the way they'd silenced Monique. But it hadn't worked, because I hadn't backed down, hadn't stopped investigating, hadn't let fear control me. The trial took 8 months to prepare, and during that time I worked closely with the prosecutors, helped them understand Monique's investigation, helped them make sense of the documents she'd compiled, helped them build the strongest case possible. And I testified at the trial. Testified about my sister, about the lunch we'd had 2 days before she died, about how excited she'd been about her story, about how there was no way she would have killed herself. And I testified about finding her evidence, about being threatened, about my apartment being ransacked, about everything I'd experienced while trying to get justice for her. The courtroom was packed every day of the trial with journalists and community members and family members of the people who'd been displaced by the Lakefront Development Project, with people who wanted to see justice served. And when the verdicts came down, they were unanimous. Vincente Caruso was convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison without parole. Benjamin Richardson, the mayor's brother, was convicted of conspiracy to commit murder, fraud, money laundering, and racketeering, and sentenced to 40 years in federal prison. The developers behind Shoreline Properties were convicted of fraud and conspiracy and received sentences ranging from 10 to 25 years. The judge who'd been rubber stamping approvals was convicted of corruption and sentenced to 15 years. The police officers who were involved were convicted and sentenced to various terms. In total, more than 30 people were arrested and convicted as a result of Monique's investigation and the subsequent FBI probe. And the Lakefront Development Project was completely shut down. The city announced it was returning all the seized properties to their original owners, was providing compensation for people who'd been displaced, was conducting environmental remediation, and implementing new oversight procedures to prevent this kind of corruption from happening again. But beyond the convictions, beyond the policy changes, the story had a deeper impact. It sparked a citywide conversation about gentrification, about displacement, about who gets to decide how neighborhoods change, about the rights of long-term residents versus the interests of developers, about corruption in city government, and about the role of investigative journalism in holding power accountable. And Monique's name became synonymous with courage and integrity and the pursuit of truth, even in the face of mortal danger. The Chicago Tribune established the Monique Williams Award for Investigative Journalism, an annual prize given to journalists who demonstrate exceptional courage in pursuing stories that serve the public interest. And David Chen was the first recipient of that award for his work finishing and publishing Monique's investigation. The Tribune also issued a formal apology for not having done more to protect Monique while she was working on the story, for not having taken her security concerns seriously enough, for not having provided her with the support and resources she needed to safely pursue such a dangerous investigation. Monique's story was covered extensively by national media. She was featured in documentaries about investigative journalism, about corruption in American cities, about the dangers journalists face when they challenge powerful interests. And every time her story was told, every time her work was recognized, I felt this bittersweet mix of pride and sorrow. Pride in what she'd accomplished, sorrow that she wasn't here to receive the recognition she deserved. My own life changed dramatically after the trial. I'd been thrust into the public eye in a way I never expected or wanted. As Monique's sister, as the person who'd continued her investigation, as someone who'd been threatened and targeted. I became part of the story. And I was interviewed by countless news outlets, was asked to speak at journalism schools and community organizations, was invited to be on panels about corruption and accountability. And at first I resisted, didn't want the attention, didn't want to be seen as capitalizing on my sister's death. But eventually I realized that speaking publicly was a way of honoring Monique, was a way of ensuring her story continued to be told, was a way of inspiring others to stand up to corruption and injustice. I also became close with David Chen. We'd been through something intense together, had shared the fear and the danger and the determination to see Monique's work published. And we stayed in touch, had lunch regularly, talked about journalism and truth.
My daughter, Jasmine, who I'd protected from much of what was happening, who I'd kept in Atlanta away from the danger, was furious when she learned the full story, was angry that I'd put myself at risk, was angry that I hadn't told her what was happening, was angry that I'd faced all of that alone. But she was also proud. Told me she'd never realized how strong I was. Told me she wanted to be like me, wanted to have that kind of courage and conviction. And hearing her say that meant more to me than any award or recognition or news coverage. The threatening note that had been slipped under my door, the one that said, "You're next," I kept it as a reminder of what I'd faced, as a reminder of the moment I'd realized I was in danger, but had decided to keep fighting anyway. And sometimes, when I'm feeling discouraged, when I'm questioning whether anything I do matters, I look at that note and I remember that I made a choice, that I chose courage over fear, that I chose truth over silence. And that choice made all the difference. It's been 3 years now since Monique died. 3 years since I got that call from Antoine in the middle of the night. 3 years since I stood on that sidewalk, watching police lights flash and trying to understand how my sister could be gone. And in those 3 years, so much has changed. The corrupt officials are in prison, the lakefront development project has been dismantled, the residents who were displaced have been able to return home, and Monique's legacy as a fearless investigative journalist who died pursuing truth has been cemented. I visit Monique's grave every week, bring her flowers, tell her about what's happening in the world, tell her about the continued impact of her work, tell her how much I miss her, how much I wish she was still here. And sometimes I imagine what she'd say if she could talk back. And I think she'd tell me she was proud, that I didn't let her death be in vain, that I finished what she started, that I made sure the truth came out. And that's what keeps me going on the hard days. When the grief feels overwhelming, when I think about all the things Monique will never get to experience, all the stories she'll never get to write, all the injustices she'll never get to expose. I've learned a lot about myself in these 3 years. I've learned that I'm braver than I thought, that I'm capable of standing up to powerful people, that I can face danger and not back down. I've learned that grief doesn't have a timeline, doesn't follow a neat progression, doesn't ever completely go away, but coexists with joy and hope and purpose. I've learned that family is complicated, that people process trauma differently, that forgiveness is necessary for healing. I've learned that truth matters, that journalism matters, that holding powerful people accountable matters,
And I've learned that one person really can make a difference, that refusing to stay silent really can change things. I'm still working at the library, still helping people find information, still organizing archives, but now I see my work differently. See it as part of a larger mission of providing access to truth, of ensuring that information isn't hidden or suppressed, of supporting the kind of research and investigation that Monique dedicated her life to. And I've started doing more community work, volunteering with organizations that fight gentrification, that support investigative journalism, that provide resources for families affected by corrupt development projects. Denise is still my closest friend, still the person I turn to when I need support or advice or just someone to listen. And she's told me many times that what I did was extraordinary, that most people would have accepted the official story about Monique's death, would have been too scared to investigate, would have backed down when threatened. But I don't feel extraordinary. I feel like I did what anyone would do for someone they loved, what any sister would do to get justice for her murdered sibling. The FBI agent, Sarah Martinez, became something of a friend as well. We stayed in touch after the trial, and she's told me that the Lakefront Development Project case became a model for how the FBI investigates corruption, that it showed the importance of working with journalists and community members and families of victims, that it demonstrated how powerful the truth can be when it's properly documented and widely shared. And she's used the case in training new agents, in teaching them how to build corruption cases. David Chen continues to do investigative journalism, continues to expose wrongdoing, continues to pursue the kind of stories that make powerful people uncomfortable. And he always acknowledges Monique in his work, always credits her with inspiring him to be more courageous. And he's told me that he thinks about her every time he starts a new investigation, every time he faces resistance or threats, every time he has to decide whether a story is worth the risk. The mayor, whose brother was convicted, ended up not running for re-election, faced too much political fallout from the scandal. And his successor ran on a platform of transparency and accountability and reforming city government. And while I'm skeptical that one person can fix systemic corruption, I'm hopeful that Monique's story has made it harder for the next generation of corrupt officials to operate with impunity, has shown people that they can demand better from their elected leaders. I think about that last lunch with Monique all the time. I think about how animated she was, how excited about her story, how certain that she was about to expose something important. And I think about how if I'd known it was the last time I'd see her, I would have said different things, would have told her how much she meant to me, would have told her to be more careful, would have insisted she accept help, would have done something, anything to prevent what happened. But I also know that Monique wouldn't have wanted to be more careful, wouldn't have wanted to wait, wouldn't have wanted to let fear stop her from pursuing truth. And that's who she was. That's the sister I knew and loved. And that's the legacy she left behind. Someone slipped a note under my door saying, "You're next," and the handwriting looked disturbingly familiar. It looked exactly like my murdered sister's handwriting. And in that moment, I realized that everything I'd suspected about her death was true, realized that powerful people had killed her to protect their secrets, realized that I was in danger too. But instead of running, instead of hiding, instead of staying silent, I chose to fight. I chose to finish my sister's investigation. I chose to expose the truth, no matter the cost. And that choice, that decision to be brave when I was terrified, to keep going when I wanted to quit, to trust that the truth would protect me even when I wasn't sure it would, that choice made all the difference. My name is Lorraine. I'm 57 years old now, and I'm a librarian who became an amateur detective who took on corrupt city officials and organized crime and won. Not because I was special, not because I was trained, not because I had some unique skill, but because I loved my sister. And I refused to let her death be meaningless, refused to let her killers get away with it, refused to accept injustice quietly. And if I can do that, if I can face that kind of danger and come out the other side, then anyone can. There's always a choice when confronted with wrongdoing. You can look away, or you can demand accountability. And I chose accountability, and that made all the difference. Monique's story, the story she died trying to tell, has now been told, has been heard by millions, has resulted in justice, has changed lives, has reformed systems. And every time I think about that, every time I see the impact of her work, I feel grateful. Grateful that I had a sister like her. Grateful that I was brave enough to fight for her. Grateful that the truth won in the end. And I know that wherever Monique is, whatever comes after this life, she knows that her work mattered, that her death was not in vain, that she made a difference. And that's what she would have wanted. That's the best way to honor her memory, by ensuring that truth and justice and accountability prevail, even when powerful people try to suppress them.